if I'm pretty much like everybody else, I can feel pretty good about myself. And we know that we talk about having a conformist society. Maybe that's just part of being a human being, wanting to fit in, wanting to belong, wanting to be like others, wanting to be liked by others. When you impose statistics on that, though, and when you do it in some kinds of social scientific projects, you end up with results like this. So little Johnny has not started speaking in full sentences, and he's 4 years old. We need to get him some therapy. And the more you micromanage that, the more you tend to break down people's lives into stages of development. And the tendency has been, historically, to label those stages of development as certain. If a person is, say, stuck in one of those stages of development, then we consider their development to have been arrested. And that's a bad thing, right? And that, actually, going back to the scientific racism, that's what scientific racists after Darwin tended to do. They would say a race was stuck at a certain stage of civilized development, so they had arrested development, and that made them inferior to those Nordics who were the most developed. So when Foucault talks about normalization in the mid-70s, he's talking about that conflation of the average and the good. And he's also talking about the way in which societies, particularly those infused with practices developed out of the social sciences, the way that they develop methods for getting people back onto that track. So your identity is created by your deviations from various norms. So you're a whatever, right? You have this IQ, you have this level of reading development, you have this level of sexual development, and so on and so forth. And however you're arrested or however you're deviated from the norm is who you are. And Foucault says, so we set up people's identities on the basis, and we make them live those identities on the basis of these norms, and we also do things therapeutically and educationally to try to enforce norms. So you're not going to let your child do things, explore aspects of his or her life that don't conform to the developmental norms. And it becomes very rigid, and it becomes very oppressive in some cases. So the normal, when it gets solidified into a certain kind of identity or a certain kind of capacity or whatever, a certain kind of body type even, the normal becomes a sort of a weapon used against people who deviate, and they become abnormal. Instead of just saying there's variation or there are differences, which is what would have been said before, although some of those differences and variations would have been considered sins. They don't necessarily get considered sins anymore. They get considered abnormalities, unhealthy lifestyles, or arrested developments, things like that. Sometimes there's also retrograde developments, so that people are throwbacks, is one of the terms that was used in the early 20th century. Throwbacks in those stages. So I wouldn't want to say that given the technologies that we have, the point we are in our history, the uses of statistics, the uses of norms, that we would want to do without them. But it is important to recognize that we have this conflation of our moral standards with really what amounts to a mathematical reality. And that can be very dangerous.